My name is Josh Rogin. I'm with the Washington Post. It's my real pleasure to be with you here this morning, mostly because it means that your industry has not yet found a way to replace my job with automation. And if you're working on that right now, stop that. Don't do that. We have an expert panel to deal with this issue tonight, but let me just frame the conversation very briefly. From the amateur's perspective, it seems that automation and artificial intelligence and the technologies that are being developed around it are moving faster than our ability as a policy community, much less as a media community, to understand, much less oversee, much less mitigate the risks of the implications of these new and emerging industries and technologies and their impacts on national security and foreign policy and human rights, et cetera. Nevertheless, there are a lot of people working hard on this issue. Very recently, I think what we're going to start with is some reflections on what we learned from the latest and ongoing crisis in our national security world, the Russia invasion of Ukraine. And I don't know about you guys, but I was pretty surprised to discover that this was actually being fought as quite a 20th century kind of conflict. And despite all of the advances, despite all of the warnings, it's really coming down to tanks and human beings and their ability to fight the tanks. And when I think about that, I think, why is it that Vladimir Zelensky has better internet in Kiev than we have in Washington, D.C.? How is it possible that even the unmanned systems are basically human-driven and human-guided? And what does that tell us about Russia and its progress on this issue? And then we're going to move quickly to the country that's probably not going to be so 20th century if and when it starts the next conflict, which is the People's Republic of China. And what does it mean to have a peer competitor that's integrated with our economy that is perhaps a peer competitor in this industry, if not surpassing us? And what does it mean that we've spent 20 years helping the Chinese government and the Chinese companies build the industries that are now poised to help their military that's pointed against us? And how do we manage different priorities in American foreign policy, one being our national security and the security of our citizens and their privacy and their human rights and the human rights of citizens all over the world, against our basic desire for openness and interconnectedness and our financial interest in building the industries of the future in a way that is collaborative. And I couldn't have asked for a better panel to speak to that tonight. Let me briefly introduce them. We have Gregory Allen, the director of the AI Governance Project and a senior fellow in the Strategic Technologies Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Until 2 months ago, he was director of Strategy and Policy at the DoD Joint Artificial Intelligence Center, where, as far as I know, one of the most recent top defense officials to actually travel to China and speak with dozens of Chinese officials and experts about this very issue. Sitting next to him, excuse me 1 second, Liza Tobin. Right, Liza? Excellent. I had a 50-50 chance, thank you. The Senior Director for Economy and Special Competitive Studies Project at the, not on my paper.
The Special Competitive Studies Project?
Yes, where is that housed?
Crystal City.
Crystal City, okay, excellent. And next we have August Cole, a former Wall Street Journal. Apologies for my paper here. August Cole, a former Wall Street Journal.
This is a great advertisement for digital you're giving us right now.
Thank you for filling the empty space, Gregory. A non-resident fellow at the Scowcroft Center at Strategy and Security at the Atlantic Council, and an author, and, of course, Margarita Konaev, a non-resident senior fellow in the Forward Defense Practice of the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. Okay, I'm going to ask each of you to give us your 3 minutes, your tightest 3 minutes, on what I've just laid out. What does the current conflict tell us about the status of AI and automation in modern warfare? And what will the next conflict, potentially with China, how will that be different? Let me start with you, Gregory.
Well, thank you all for joining us here today. It's a pleasure to be with you. I'll start with the conflict in Ukraine. Josh described this as a 20th century conflict. I think there are elements of that that are true. We haven't seen a conflict on this scale in quite a long time. But many aspects of this conflict really highlight what has been changing in the 21st century. Unmanned systems and remotely piloted systems and autonomous systems were all the sorts of things that some had argued were not going to be a part of a high-intensity fight, that they were only going to be relevant to counterinsurgency conflicts. I think that myth has been blown wide open. But what we've only seen is the first move in which there will always be counter-moves. So a lot of the unmanned systems that we're seeing in use in this conflict that have been really remarkably effective are, as Josh said, remotely piloted. There have been some claims of Russia using AI-enabled autonomous weapon systems. I've reviewed the same evidence of that, and I don't find them to be credible. But we do know that this is an area that Russia is going, and just in the last couple weeks, Russian military organizations have been discussing in Russian language press exactly how that's the direction that they want to be going. And as I said before, this is the first in a series of technology military steps with moves and counter moves. A lot of those counter moves are going to be taking away the remotely piloted aspect of the system. As more electronic warfare systems get introduced into this conflict, as more other UAV countermeasures come into the conflict, the pressure on all sides to go towards increasingly autonomous systems, that's what we should expect from the next stage. Just to talk briefly on the Chinese side of this equation, as Josh said, I've traveled to China a lot, both before I was a DoD government official and also while I was at the DoD. And I sat next to a senior Chinese weapons executive at a conference like this one, in which he addressed an audience that was global and said, in the future, there will be no people fighting in wars, and that is the direction that my company is working to build, talking about his autonomous systems development efforts. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Liza, give us your perspective on each of these.
Thanks so much, Josh. It's great to be here. So I think given that my background is mainly in China policy, I'll focus my remarks kind of on the broader context of China's technology strategy and how this applies to autonomy. And I think it's important to always understand the Chinese strategy in this context of economic and technological and military developments happening in tandem and really being inextricably linked. So I think in recent years, there really has been kind of a misunderstanding in the US, at least in Washington, among policymakers about China's technology strategy. And I think in some cases, this has meant that Washington has been somewhat slow to respond to the nature and the stakes of this contest with China over technology. For a long time, we in the China watching community sort of discounted the idea, the notion that China could innovate. And I know that sounds somewhat quaint in 2022, given the challenges we face, but that indeed was the case for years. We were really focused on China stealing and copying technology. And while that indeed was a problem, I think what it obscured was that the Chinese Communist Party is trying to do something new with technology, and fundamentally, this is political. The Chinese Communist Party believes that its system of governance offers certain advantages over Western-style democracy and capitalism, namely the ability to marshal state resources towards major state projects, including in autonomy, and then also a view of technology that prioritizes the needs of the state over the needs of the individuals. Now, Xi Jinping is a good Marxist, and sometimes when he talks about history, he says, we are seeing changes not seen in a century. And of course, he's talking about things like the centers of global power and the global economy shifting from east to west. But also he's talking about new frontiers emerging in fields like space, autonomy, biotech, things like that. And the party has determined that it is not only an opportunity, but there's a necessity here for China to be on the leading edge of these emerging domains. Now, what does this have to do with autonomy? Well, the crux of the issue with autonomy, of course, right now is data. Who can harness the most data? Now, in the future, maybe in a few years, we'll have this conference and we'll be talking about synthetic data. But for now, I think the party is somewhat ahead of our political leadership here in elevating the importance of data in their national strategy and in investment. And I think going forward, we need to understand the political nature here, and that they're really kind of throwing down the gauntlet and saying our system is better at exploiting this data and coming up with innovation not only to drive economic development, but also advances in military use technology. And so, I think it certainly remains to be seen whether they will succeed. Fundamentally, I'm an optimist about our system and our advantages, but I think the outcome is not guaranteed.
Excellent, thank you. August.
Well, as someone whose career started, chasing down facts and evolved into making stuff up, I offer, these comments with a lot of humility, sitting in the National Press Club. But I think what I would say, Josh, is, with the conflict in Ukraine, I think it has really underscored, how important these kinds of technologies we're here to talk about today are to the next 20 years of conflict. That even if we are going to debate, even what is artificial intelligence? Like, this is an active debate in the U.S. right now in the tech community, the DoD itself. We have a lot of big foundational, aspects we have to address. At the same time, you look at the tactical situation in Ukraine, and you can see how vital and how much of that conflict actually almost rests upon a foundation of AI-type capabilities, whether it's crowdfunding, whether it's using the sorts of algorithmic refinement for targeting and electronic warfare and all the stuff that happens behind a very thick curtain. We know that at the same time you have trenches and artillery, code is fundamental to this conflict. So when you look across the Pacific to what we might expect with China in the late 2020s, perhaps sooner, perhaps later, we have to, I think, have that same tension in mind. We have to understand where the big pieces that we're still trying to move around in our country and where they are trying to move around there as well. As someone who's trying constantly to think credibly about what's coming, it's very hard to get things right. And I don't know that we have to always do so, but how we go about doing that is vital. And the one thing I think I would say, especially when you look at the missed opportunities in understanding what was going to happen in Afghanistan, what was going to happen in Ukraine, is to really hone in on the human aspects of these conflicts. It's very easy to get focused on policy. Specifically, it's easy to get focused on technologies, like we're looking at with China, and really try to remind ourselves that, there are, conflict is a human experience, even if it is shaped and evolving with, of course, and through technology. But fundamentally, that ability to practice good foresight and really get it, like what's coming, what elements are going to be present today, in the future, and beyond, comes down to that foundational, I think, point of view.
Excellent, thank you. Rita?
Excuse me, August, I feel like you set me up with the sentence of trying to see what's right, because as somebody who's been studying the Russian military and focusing on technological innovation and military modernization in Russia, I feel like I've gotten a lot of things wrong. And if you are looking at the performance of the Russian military right now, it was very difficult to tell that the last decade and a half has been, in fact, dedicated to significant reforms that focused on professionalization, that focused on new equipment, autonomous capabilities, a lot of robotics, unmanned systems, electronic warfare, AI for command and control, information, cyber warfare. There were grand expectations, and we have not seen them pan out. So it is bringing a point of reflection for the community that has, been studying Russia, both from the open source, and I'm a native Russian speaker. I follow the sources, from the horse's mouth, let's say it like that, as well as the fact that a lot of the more classified intelligence was also pointing that way. So if we're looking over the past now almost 3 months, what are some of the early lessons learned that we can take away to better understand how we got some of these things quite wrong? And I'm going to make the first unpopular point by saying that we are often conflating concepts and technologies that are in the conceptualization, research, and development stages to what is already out there, to let alone what is battle-tested, battle-ready, and battle-proven. There's a marketing element to it. There's a tendency to rely on the companies that are advancing these and selling these. And there's a tendency to repeat what we are hearing from the sources themselves. And I think we need to be increasingly more skeptical. And that is a point that is relevant for journalists, for analysts, and for intelligence observers themselves. And that is something that I think is also very critical for understanding China, where China is and where China is going, and not only just what they're thinking and what is the strategy, but what is actually already ready to go and ready to be used. The second point, I think, also builds on the human element issue, is the difference between innovation and integration, innovation and adoption. What we're seeing right now is that the technical barriers to innovation are really not the most significant barrier to the use and scaling and integration of some of these sophisticated and advanced technologies and operations. A lot of it has to do with institutional, bureaucratic, cultural, human trust issues, trust let alone between humans and machines, but between the humans themselves, civil-military relations. Those barriers are not technical in nature, they're not technological, but they are indeed very human and very societal and institutional, and we have to keep them in mind. Finally, on a technological point, for every investment we are making in autonomy and every investment we are making in AI, we have to be thinking about how to counter those capabilities. So the fact that the Ukrainian military is able to inflict such massive damage with quite rudimentary and relatively cheap drones is significant. And perhaps the United States would have been more prepared for such attacks through integrated defenses, better electronic warfare capabilities. But by all assessments, Russia had some of the most sophisticated electronic warfare capabilities in the world, and they are unable to deter or defend against that threat. So we have to be thinking about countering autonomy and countering AI going forward. When we're looking about what's next for Russia in its modernization efforts and its efforts to get its tanks out of the Ukrainian mud and out of the hands of the Ukrainian farmers, it's hard to tell. I'm a little worried about the pendulum swinging to a point where we completely underestimate what comes next from the Russian perspective. It's useful to remember it is still a nuclear power with a decent amount still of conventional capabilities, so keeping that in mind. And the relationship between Russia and China is also going to be very interesting and complicated, but not only Russia and China, but also Russia and India and Russia and Israel from the technological alignment perspective. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. Fascinating to start to apply the lessons learned from what we see in Russia and Ukraine to the larger problem, because we can be sure that our adversaries are doing the exact same analysis. And that brings us perfectly to our first round of questions. Before I get to that, I'd like to just let you know in the audience that we will have some time for audience questions. And if you would like to submit one, the way to do it is by emailing asknexus22@gmail.com or by using the app. So you can start to enter those now, and we'll get to a couple of those in just a bit. But Rita, your segue actually leads us perfectly back to Gregory, because he has done some of the most important work on China's AI strategy. And if you haven't read this document yet, I encourage you to read it after the panel. I made the mistake of reading it last night, and then I was so scared I couldn't go to sleep. It's some pretty shocking stuff, to be honest. And I want you to, first of all, the thing that stuck out to me most was that the Chinese Communist Party is essentially doing two things at once. They're calling for international norms and international negotiations and international, essentially, arms control for AI in a very public and way that sounds very appealing. At the same time, they're engaging in the arms race they're protesting against simultaneously, which is pretty common for arms races, as it turns out. So using that as sort of the jumping off point, can you tell us what you know about the current effort to engage with the Chinese government and the US government and vice versa on this issue diplomatically behind the scenes?
Sure, and let me start with a bit of a digression. For a long time now, there's been a worldwide conversation around the unique and frankly weird failure modes of machine learning AI systems. And there's been a related conversation around the ethical use of these systems. And I think what the war in Ukraine reminds us is that while it is obviously a massive tragedy when there is accidental deaths, accidental civilian deaths from the result of technical failures, intentional civilian deaths is still an unsolved problem on Earth. And the Russian forces are reminding us of that tragedy just about every single day. So now pivoting to China in this kind of conversation, there are Chinese academics, there are Chinese members of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs who have loudly been calling for arms control. One thing it would behoove everyone to remember is that the Chinese system is different than the American system. So whereas our military is a part of our government, their military is a part of the Communist Party. And while they have the same boss, they have different reporting structures and different functional governance structures. So all of the talk around AI arms control has thus far been coming out of either academic institutions who do not speak for the government, or to a lesser extent, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. When I was at the Department of Defense, we tried multiple times to have a conversation around military AI risk reduction with the Chinese People's Liberation Army, and were refused multiple times. This is a conversation that thus far they have shown no interest in engaging in, and I think that's unfortunate.
Are you suggesting that the Chinese government may not be genuine in its protestations, that it really is for arms control and diplomatic negotiations in this area?
So I don't claim to be a mind reader. There are multiple plausible interpretations of what's going on. One is just the bureaucracies of the Chinese system disagreeing with each other. Another interpretation is insincerity. Another interpretation is something else that I haven't thought of yet. Right? There's multiple possible explanations. But the fact is the United States has been taking criticism in the international community and in the press as somebody who is dragging their heels on international norms and dialogues related to military AI risk reduction. We are not the ones dragging our feet in this topic. As I said, China has refused this conversation multiple times.
Very interesting. Thank you. Liza, let me ask you, since you mentioned data, to explain to our audience how the Chinese government and the Chinese Communist Party collects data, uses that data, and how they integrate their corporate and military and human rights policy through AI using that data. And what kind of challenge does that pose to us as competitors, and also to us as a community of free and open societies who believes that people have certain rights?
Thanks, Josh. Yeah, so as I mentioned, they have a massive strategy called Digital China. They are certainly focused on this as a new source of economic growth and innovation. Again, I'll come back to the fact that they're good Marxists, and they have actually updated their Marxist theory to add data as a fourth factor of production. And for those of you who may be a little bit rusty on your Marxist theory, the original three are land, labor, and capital. So when you put them all together in creative ways, it produces economic growth. But unfortunately, the Chinese economy is slowing. The era of easy industrialization and demographic growth is over, and so they can't squeeze any more marginal productivity out of land, labor, and capital. Enter data, this new fourth factor of production. And so they are betting that this is a way out of the middle income trap, and that by adding data and exploiting the many benefits and opportunities of data, they can actually grow their economy in ways that we can't. So I think here in the West, when we talk about data, we're often talking about it in the rubric of privacy, and of course that's very important, but it is a defensive perspective rather than this offensive perspective that the CCP is taking. A couple of the use cases that you may be familiar with from China, of course, is their so-called Digital Silk Road, which is kind of a subsidiary of the Belt and Road Initiative, and is really their effort and their plan to control the networks, the platforms, and importantly, the standards of this emerging digital economy. And then at home, the use case, of course, is technology-enabled social control. And you see that most dramatically in Xinjiang with the internment of more than 1 million people, but really across the country, and it's showing up in the COVID lockdowns. And so really, you're seeing the elevation of political concerns being elevated over short-term economic concerns there.
Excellent. August, that sort of takes me to the issue of the ethics, which you talk about a lot. As a former journalist, I know you covered a lot. From the journalist perspective, what we see is sort of the conundrum of American companies, the American government, collaborating with a lot of these Chinese companies, which, as we've just heard, cannot really be said to be anything but under the control of the party that wants to use the technology and the data for other means. Google built an AI center in China but refused to do an AI project with the Pentagon. SenseTime worked with MIT until 2019. Even after it was sanctioned by the US government, it still had a successful IPO with the help of many technical experts in the US and around the world. IBM is partnered with dozens of Chinese cities on Smarter Cities program, which to my mind seems like a clear abuse of the technology. Hikvision, the company that has built the cameras atop the concentration camp walls that spot the Uyghurs, they've been sanctioned by the US government but funded to the brim by Wall Street. How can we understand that? And how is it that we have a system that's punishing these companies on the one hand and funding them on the other? And what do you think we need to do to square that circle?
I mean, I think you can look at technology ethics beyond just artificial intelligence. You have to expand it to, what's coming with synthetic biology, for example. But as it relates to, AI and particularly the consumer technologies or, commercial technologies that scale and allow social control, but also may aid in, imagine, the refinement of a hypersonic, payload vehicle. We're going to, in the U.S., I think, need to be increasingly vigilant. And fundamentally, when you look at like these ethical frameworks, whether it's for the conduct of conflict, laws of armed conflict, international humanitarian law, and those sorts of constructs, or on the commercial side, we're going to be asking a lot more, I think, of American leadership and our allies to make ethical decisions. And I think that's a crucial point that in a period of time, particularly as we just experienced a massive body blow to valuations in the tech sector, there is going to be a lot of pressure, especially as funding gets harder to raise for early stage companies, et cetera, to turn away from money that may not be as easy, or maybe easier, I should say, than right. I would also pivot to the question of how we look at the ethics of AI in armed conflict, and particularly sub-threshold conflict. If you look at like a lot of the strategic conversation, whether it's in the conventional military or special operations, about this kind of continuum or this contest, right, that we're setting up with China over the next 10 to 15 years, where we're going to be engaging at the commercial level, at the cultural level. We're going to be trying to look for advantage or ways to keep conflict from breaking out, or if we get into a fight, to win it quickly. That is also going to return to your question about the role of American companies and allies, they're going to be involved in that conflict in ways that they may not be ready for yet. That requires, at a board level, at a compliance level, really like rich conversations that fundamentally don't allow for failure of imagination. And I think that's something that probably has to start happening sooner than most people are ready for. To piggyback just on the data comment too, if you think about what a conflict with China is going to look like potentially, right, in the Pacific, it's going to be fundamentally decided by data, most likely. Yes, you'll have to hold parts of the ocean and control them, space, et cetera, undersea. But fundamentally, the side that can, I think, most effectively use data will be the one that prevails. So what are our rules, right? On the government side, on the industry side, what do we expect of our society when it comes to privacy, when it comes to the use of data that we can acquire on the open market? You could imagine today the kinds of capabilities that are performed by a drone or a satellite. Much of that can be bracketed or acquired on the open market to provide incredible levels of like fidelity or targeting, to put it simply. When you're in an environment where the satellites are knocked out and there's no drones going over the Pacific, how are you going to find the things you need to find, the people you need to find? I'd rather have those conversations now, today, with a little bit of imagination and think through those outcomes so we can make the decisions that we can live with when a conflict's over.
Before I move on, let me just press you on this one point, because as we saw in the last administration, a lot of this is detailed in my book, Chaos Under Heaven, available now wherever books are sold. The Trump administration made a determined effort to name and shame American companies that were seen to be aiding China's effort to use American technology and know-how and capital to build this AI machine that they're working on with their military. That naming and shaming had, positive and negative effects, to be sure. And we see to my mind, I see the Biden administration continuing some of that, although in quite a different manner. I'm wondering, what do you think is the solution for managing the private-public cooperation on this issue on our end? Should the government be telling companies what to do? Should companies in the industry be taking it upon themselves to establish rules of corporate social responsibility? How's that working out? And how do we have a system where our institutions guard their independence fiercely and rightly at the same time? This is kind of a problem that they need the federal government's help on.
Yeah, that's a really thorny one. Thank you. I know I'm sitting here in Washington, D.C., so it'd be obvious to say we should regulate it. But I don't believe that. I don't think you can keep up with the vagaries of the financial markets. I don't think you can keep up with the pace of innovation. Fundamentally, this is like a culture question in American business and in the technology community. That leadership comes from individual decisions, not necessarily from a mandate from on high. That's how China works, right? We don't want to have a system that puts us in a position where we don't allow the agility, the kind of freedom of action. But that has a lot of responsibility that goes with it. If companies can't, essentially rise to that, then you're looking at, I think, a situation which is not just about not performing in the long term, but it imperils the security of the country. We've had, the 20th century, much of it with a conversation about big companies making decisions that were in the interest of the national security of the United States. There's no reason why we can't have that again.
Thank you. Let me go to Rita, and then we'll come back to you. And Rita, feel free to continue that thread, but I also wanted to ask you to apply what we've seen in the U.S.-Russia corporate-to-corporate relationship post-Ukraine invasion. In other words, we're seeing American corporations decouple from Russian corporations. We're seeing Russian finance dry up, support for Russian companies by American finance dry up. A real startling, actually, decoupling of our two economies as punishment, as a coercive method to get Vladimir Putin to stop attacking Ukraine. And the obvious question is that something that can be applied to China? Would it even work considering the size and interconnectedness of our two economies? And from what you see in what we're doing to the Russian economy, is that working? Is that having its desired effect? And feel free to also comment on what August just said.
As neither an economist nor a China person, thank you for that question. I'm just gonna, build on what August was saying in terms of whether it's a public shaming or accountability or aligning national security concerns with corporate responsibility. I think consumers have changed significantly over the past 2 decades. This new generation, whether it's millennials or Gen Z, a lot of them want to know where did their products come from, whether they're sourced responsibly. You see that in the fashion industry, you see that in mining industry, you see that in all sorts of products. And I think it's important to kind of build on that momentum and not simply argue from that hardcore, old school national security perspective, but also from a fundamental human rights perspective and social accountability perspective. In the same way that we care about climate change and renewals and sustainability, we should care about where the components of our phones come from and where, what does the technology that we're spending money on is used. In terms of the commercial activities and integration and decoupling from Russia, it's a much easier effort to execute because it's a smaller economy and the integration is not that significant. It's absolutely much less significant than it is with China, and it's also been declining quite rapidly since 2014. So movement in that direction didn't just start yesterday. What is interesting to watch is who has been replacing those ties and how Russia has been trying to effectively not necessarily insulate itself to the effect of Western sanctions, because that's something that it will never be able to do, but to make its economy, its technology sector, its science innovation capabilities more resilient, whether it's through investment in domestic production or it's through, again, relationships with China, relationship with India, relationship with Russia, with Israel. I just read yesterday that Yandex, the CEO of Yandex, which is the Russian Google effectively, who is, by the way, an Israeli citizen, is send a memo to the Israeli government asking about conditions and possibilities to relocate the center of operations to Tel Aviv. There's already a pretty significant operation there, and now they're talking about moving their global center to Israel. That's going to complicate those types of relationships. So we got to be watching for these third order effects. So while that direct integration between Russia and the United States might have not feel as impactful because those ties are not that notable, the relationships that we have with our allies, including, not to hone in on Israel, but Israel and India and others are going to be important. And I'm just going to push back on that point that you said that the sanctions are being enforced to make Vladimir Putin to stop the war. We're actually not 100% sure that that is the end goal of the sanctions. It has not been declared that the minute that Vladimir Putin withdraws from Ukraine or withdraws from, to the eastern part or stops the war, that the sanctions are going to be removed. If anything, there isn't really an indication of an end date, which also kind of, makes you question what is the incentive that Putin's now facing to end the war if there's no end to the sanctions inside. So we got to be thinking about how we want to use these instruments of economic pressure and economic statecraft going forward towards China.
Excellent. Yeah, I should have been clear that that's what the Biden administration claims, is that the sanctions are meant to pressure Putin and his cronies to stop the atrocities and the invasion. But you're right, there are probably a lot of factors going into it. And we could have a whole panel on the ethics of the Israeli tech industry, but we're just not going to have time for that today. But it does bring us back to you, Gregory, because what we're hearing is that the war, a conflict, a potential contingency with China, and now we're thinking about a potential Chinese invasion of Taiwan, will be very different for all of the reasons that we've just heard, for all of their capabilities, for all of the interconnectedness that we have with our industries, and for all of the relative tools that we're using now that may not be effective the next time. So let me just ask you directly, and anybody on the panel can take a crack at this one. What would automation and AI look like in a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, in a potential Chinese invasion of Taiwan, and what can we do now to prepare for that?
Well, I think the answer to that question depends on when.
Let's say 2027.
Right. The reason why I raised that is because the Chinese military is in the midst of a major AI-enabled modernization effort. They are really changing a lot of the way that they do what they do. There was a report by the former China bureau chief in Nikan that basically said Xi Jinping was shaken by what he has seen in the Ukrainian conflict, where cheap, crummy, commercially derived UAVs were taking out expensive military-specific hardware. And in witnessing that, he was wondering, did I just make a mistake spending tens of billions of dollars to build an aircraft carrier fleet? That report may or may not be true, but it is absolutely the case that the Chinese military is drawing a lot of lessons from what we're seeing in Ukraine. And that's why time matters a lot. But as I said, we've been at this story for quite a while. Project Maven in the Department of Defense was all the way back in 2017. So AI is already making a big difference in the Department of Defense. I'm not satisfied with the pace of adoption. I don't believe a lot of people in the Department of Defense are satisfied with the pace of adoption, but it already is making a big impact, including in what the DoD is up to in Ukraine. And that is true of what's going on with the Chinese military. That is true of what's going on in the Russian military. I think we should expect a lot to change in a relatively short period of time.
Thank you. Liza, you had something that you wanted to say?
Oh, sure. Thanks, Josh. No, I wanted to get back to your point about, is naming and shaming companies the right approach? I think a more productive approach would really let the government be the governance. I think it is the government's role to set common sense left and right limits and say, give companies a clearer sense of the direction where policy is going. And coming out of both the Trump and the Biden White House, I can tell you that there's tremendous continuity in the direction of policy, in the direction of we need to disentangle some of the more sensitive aspects of the US-China technology and economic relationship. The US government, as you all from the private sector know, is very slow. So I know you're waiting to get more policy clarity, but I think the direction is assured. And for the government to set those right limits and say, you know, it is unacceptable for American expertise and technology and capital to be aiding and abetting the PLA war machine. I think getting that clarity sooner and giving companies, you know, a reasonable amount of time to figure out their compliance is better than kind of kicking the can down the road and leaving things unclear. And on the company side, I think you all are ahead of the U.S. government in actually designing the technical solutions. So in terms of kind of the proactive foreign policy front, I think the U.S. government needs to be talking to the private sector and hearing what solutions you're coming up with so that we can be pushing for those in the standards bodies.
Thank you. We're going to go to August in a second, but let me just press you on that, because you're right. We do have a private sector audience here that has not been properly engaged by our government and has not been given correct, fulsome guidance on how to navigate these very thorny issues. So how about you do that now? And specifically, is there any ethical way to collaborate on AI and autonomy with Chinese companies that are definitely under the control of the CCP and probably kicking all the technology out the back door to the PLA? And is it just an ethical issue? Because when I look at the China's tech industry, what I see is a crackdown. What I see is the party installing itself in control of all of these companies, destroying their ability to function independently, taking trillions of dollars of valuation out of them on purpose in order to exert political control. So when I look at American industry and Wall Street, for example, I wonder, shouldn't they factor that into their calculations, especially their economic calculations? And what does it mean if the Chinese tech company just becomes another arm of the CCP? Doesn't that mean that we're taking on a lot of additional risk for our investors that we're not, material risk actually, that we're not properly thinking about?
Thanks. Yeah, and I certainly don't speak for the U.S. government. I've left government, but just my personal views on that. No, I agree with a lot of that, Josh. I think that in terms of where the government has set the needle, it's the job of the government to send these signals about where the risk is in China. Companies are very interested in understanding the national security risk, fiduciary risk, economic risk, shareholder risk, all these types of risks, and I think they're very good at setting up compliance mechanisms and directing their investments as long as the U.S. government is sending clear signals. But there is no clear line. Autonomy and some of these other technologies are inherently dual use, and I think sometimes the U.S. government gets themselves, and I can speak from personal experience, tied up in knots, trying to find this perfect dividing line where we're allowing all quote-unquote civilian and commercial investments to proceed and walling off all the military. Well, in a perfect world, we'd do that, but as you all know, these things are inherently mixed and blended, and I think it's better to have a little more clarity now than sort of leave the policy uncertain and kick it down the road and hope that we'll somehow be able to untangle the two sides of this tech, which is impossible.
If I may, I think the Munich Security Conference was coming through town just the other week, so there's a lot of European diplomats and European security officials, and I will say the mood in Europe is that the peace through trade hypothesis really took a beating from Russia's invasion, and that is true deep within the European security establishment. The second thing I'll say is, on my own travel to China, one of the times I went to a venture capital pitching event where Chinese companies were talking with Western and other investors. And one of the companies there was a SenseTime executive, and he had specifically mentioned that it is extremely unusual in China's history for a technology as important as artificial intelligence to be trusted to the private sector. And he gave the examples of nuclear weapons and rocketry as the sort of peer comparisons. Keep in mind, this is him pitching to venture capitalists, talking about his relationship with the Chinese government. And what I took away from that was that it was going to be okay for these Chinese private sector companies to continue to be independent as long as they provided support to the Chinese security establishment. But as you've said, even I was shocked at what's happened in terms of the crackdown on Chinese companies over the past year and a half or so, and the degree to which the Communist Party has insisted upon a degree of control that over the past decade it was content to ignore.
Thank you. August?
I was going to pull the thread a little on this Taiwan question, and I think it links to the conversation we're having now, also about the role of companies. Every company in the technology sector needs to have had that conversation or have that conversation. What are you going to do when that happens? And that's not to say that every Taiwan scenario looks like a cross-strait invasion and is at that kind of scale and catastrophe. But this is the world we live in, right? You need to kind of see it. And I think it's critical to have that kind of foresight, which isn't drawn from much more than what we see around us. To the point too about when, right? When would that conflict be? What would the role of AI be? Like with the commercial side, I think we're actually talking as much about culture as we are technology in both the private sector, but also the U.S. military. I believe later today, Commodore Michael Bursar from Task Force 59 from the Navy will be here, right? Part of the kind of grassroots and institutional movement to adopt and experiment with autonomous systems, to use new kinds of software capabilities. Those are not the norm. Those are not scaled. We have a lot, I think, that we can be doing a much more greater and horizontal, like distribution of such efforts, so that we're able to, in a conflict like we're talking about, have gotten people at both the tactical level, but really at the most senior level in the services, et cetera, bought into this idea that the paradigm that was set in the Cold War of $200 million fighter planes is over. Should we have a 350 ship Navy or a 3,350 ship Navy? What is a ship? Those are the kinds of fundamental shifts that are very, very difficult to make for a nation like ours, for military like ours. Yet that may be actually what is most important when you start thinking through the realities of a very high intensity conflict like with China.
Excellent, thank you. And we are going to I'm going to read a couple of these audience questions. Before we do that, very quickly, August, I have to ask you, I was reading some of your work about cognitive warfare, and this really freaked me out. And,
me too.
And explain to us briefly what that is and what that means.
Sure, and this is an area where Rita has a lot of expertise too. The idea that with artificial intelligence, we are now able to shape messaging and the inputs that we take into our, if you want to think about yourself as a computer, we take into our own systems. And if you're now able to shape that through social media and other forms of electronic manipulation at scale, but with incredible precision, and we've kind of talked around again data on this panel, but the amount of data that's out there, the amount of increasingly capable artificial intelligence systems that can refine large lakes of data or whatever you want to call them to affect how people are responding at a neurological level to the world around them, the world as it will be, and maybe even as it was. That should really frighten you. And it is both offensive, but also potentially defensive in how it is used by different nations. So imagine the kinds of disinformation campaigns that we've seen during everything from domestic uprisings here in the US, like the insurrection on Capitol Hill, to the election, to COVID. Imagine that during a large-scale conflict with China. What would the messaging be? How would the American population be shifted algorithmically without people knowing, or maybe people allowing themselves to be shifted, right? Confirming those biases and feelings that are quite powerful. That is an emergent way of warfare. Should there be a human domain, a cognitive domain? That's one of the debates that's out there. But I think it's incredibly important for people in the technology community, particularly AI, but also synthetic biology and its attendant subsectors, to be aware of that and to be frightened of it, to be honest.
Wow. So we have cyber force, we have space force, and now we're going to have mind force.
Basically.
Great. Excellent. What could go wrong? What could go wrong? that kind of leads us back into this question that I got from the audience, which focuses on the effect that autonomy and especially autonomous platforms, aircraft, boats, ships, whatever, how that is actually a really competitive and in ways asymmetric advantage for our adversaries. And this is something, Gregory, that I also read in your paper, that because of the way this town works and because of the way our government works, we're so invested in these legacy platforms that when China comes around and they skip all of that stuff and go right to the swarms, that's a huge asymmetric advantage, much like China skipping credit cards and going right to mobile payments, or skipping landlines and going right to cell phones. So this is a question from the audience. What does that mean to our future capabilities of our national security posture? Let's start with you, Gregory, and then anyone else who would like to take a crack at it.
So I think August made a great point here about the bureaucratic structures of the Department of Defense and the military as an obstacle to adopting artificial intelligence. It is really hard to get good at operating nuclear submarines. It is really hard to train really high-performing fighter pilots. There is a lot of bureaucratic organizational structure. There is a lot of muscle memory in the system for how to perform those things well. And as long as those things remain the pillar of competitive military advantage, then all is well and good. But as August was pointing out, the nature of competitive military advantage, the underpinnings of that, require new technological skill sets, and our organizational structures are not really adapting to come to terms with that. I loved what you said, right, about how many fights we have had in Washington, D.C. about a 300-ship Navy. And as you pointed out, right, the conversation we need to be is, what would it take to have a 3,000-ship Navy, but instead of those ships costing $10 billion a pop, maybe they cost $100,000 a pop. What we've been seeing in Ukraine is munitions such as those made by Northrop Grumman or others, where these are kamikaze drones that cost somewhere between, cost low tens of thousands of dollars a shot, that are annihilating million-dollar tanks, at volume. There is a cost and competitiveness revolution going on in military technology, all of which is underpinned by the progress that we've seen in commercial digital technology, not least of which is artificial intelligence. And our institutions, we have made some progress in this direction, but I think the scale of the transformation is even larger than we had previously assumed to be the case. That's something we have to figure out how to get right. And as we've heard, the Russians wanted this too. They haven't done an especially job getting there, but boy, is there a lot of pressure on them right now. And I think we've seen throughout history Russia really underperforming in the early stage of just about every war, and that not necessarily being a great predictor of what the long-term outlook looks like.
Excellent. Let's move to the next audience. Oh, do you have something you want to say, Rita?
I think I just want to make a quick but I think an important point. So we are absolutely correct in trying to understand and improve on the institutional, bureaucratic, budgetary constraints that are imperiling progress of AI and autonomy adoption across DoD. But we should also be very clear that concepts like military-civil fusion or the integration between the commercial and the political and the military sectors in China, they sound like everything is streamlined and effective. And we know that authoritarian systems are not effective systems. They might appear effective from the outside because there is this humdrum of activity and plans and declarations. And this is not by any means to say that China can't innovate. We clearly know that it can, or that China can't adopt. But we need to understand that the bureaucratic barriers that we face in a free society are probably very much existent in not free society. And what we're learning from the massive underperformance of the Russian military is not necessarily a technological or technical lesson. It's a lesson about civil-military relations in an authoritarian country that prohibits initiative, that gets in the way of effective command and control, that gets in the way of taking action to salvage an operation that is clearly going defunct, let alone prevent it by saying, no, actually, you are probably not going to take Kiev in 2 days. So all of these, I'm not to say that like our own self-assessment should be very critical for a fact if we must improve. But we also need to be very clear-eyed about our adversaries and our competitors, as much about their successes and achievements, as well as about the barriers that they face.
That's a very good point. Thank you. Thank you.
If I could just briefly push back
Sure.
on a little bit of what you said, Rita. It is definitely the case that Russia's corruption, which is endemic into their system, has been an obstacle to military progress. But I would say you go a little bit too far when you say authoritarian regimes cannot produce high-performing militaries. I would say the militaries of World War II, many of those were high-performing authoritarian regime militaries. And in the case of China, I think I recall back in 2010 timeframe, there was a line you heard a lot in this town, which was China cannot innovate, they can only copy. That was a long time ago. Right, that's over. China's private sector is really competitive. Mark Zuckerberg has admitted multiple times that he stole ideas of features for stuff that Facebook has put out from Chinese companies and Chinese services like WeChat. We've seen an enormous renaissance in the Chinese commercial digital sector, and I will say what I have seen in the Chinese military sector is also just objectively quite impressive.
I'll just say, both things can be true, that we overestimated the Russian capability because we failed to understand the weaknesses of authoritarian systems, and at the same time, China is not Russia. And
This is not what I'm
even
saying, and I didn't say that they
please.
cannot innovate. I explicitly said I am not saying that they cannot innovate. And I'm not also saying that authoritarian militaries cannot be effective. They can be very effective. The point is that we're at this self-assessment that stresses all of our weaknesses without understanding that there are critical problems that exist within our adversaries and competitors that we must understand if we want to compete with them effectively, not just their strengths.
Excellent. Yes, there are definitely weaknesses in the Russian system that we can exploit in the Chinese system. I think you're both right. Last question, and I'll put this one to Liza. This is from the audience. We've talked a lot about how the Chinese political system gives them an advantage on data because there's no such thing as privacy, and there's no such thing as rule of law, and there's no such thing as a division between the private and public sectors. So they're getting tons of data, which is hugely valuable and hugely important. How can we compete with that while maintaining our values? What can we do more to close that gap without becoming the thing that we're fighting?
Thanks. And just to kind of build on Rita's point, I think it's absolutely true that we need to understand the weaknesses of our autocratic rivals and then find ways to exploit them, which has not to date been an objective of U.S.-China policy. And I think it could unlock a lot of creativity in the U.S. government bureaucracy to state that is an objective and then get people's wheels turning. So perhaps I'll just end it at that.
Well, I think we've got all of our wheels turning now, so I hope this has been a good framing for the busy day that you guys have ahead of you. Let's give another round of applause to our excellent panelists, and thank you very much.